Thanks, Alex, for giving me the opportunity to sort of take the conversation in a little bit of a different direction. I am going to be talking about Micro Saas. So the first and obvious question is, what is Micro Saas? When I'm talking about Micro Saas, I'm talking about a small SaaS company, pretty much the same business model, but a solo entrepreneur or a small team. It's typically bootstrapped and going after a niche market. And it's also really prioritizing profits and business sustainability as opposed to growth, which is probably the big area where it starts to differentiate from what people think of as traditional SaaS. Micro Saas is probably another term of technical jargon that the industry doesn't need, but when I sort of coined it and started writing about it, I found actually there's a lot of entrepreneurs now that the sort of cost to deploy SaaS has come down. They're doing some really interesting things in this business. And so why do I talk about Micro Saas? I am the owner of a very simple niche SaaS product called StoreMapper. It's for merchants to power a store locator app on any kind of website or CMS or e-commerce platform. What I basically wanted to do is to talk about first a little bit of the story of what it's like kind of building a tiny SaaS company, and then also to try to draw a couple of lessons from my own experience and the experience of some other entrepreneurs that I think might be useful or something to think about for macro SaaS, big SaaS, normal SaaS. So we're going to do a little timeline, and it starts with 2011 consultant Tyler. He's got more suit and less beard. And 2011 consultant Tyler doesn't really know anything about how to code, about tech startups. But it's late 2011, and the Lean Startup has just come out, and 500 Startups and Y Combinator are in the news, and Code Academy is telling everyone that you probably should and could learn to code yourself. So I did the only logical thing, which was to quit my job and try to start a venture-backed company in the solar energy software space. So that in and of itself is its own kind of entire saga that I don't really have time to get into, but it was this sort of context in which my Micro Saas was formed. So this little orange line represents a whole bunch of craziness, adventures, failures that I can't really talk about. But in late 2011, I started teaching myself to code. I don't know if any of you guys recognize the Ruby on Rails Michael Hartle book, but that's where I started. And through 2012, I was still working on a startup, but started to do some freelancing for an e-commerce space, so for e-commerce merchants, developing code, and a bunch of them said, hey, we need this store locator. I think a lot of SaaS stories start that way, where you're freelancing and a bunch of your clients ask for the same kind of thing, and you think, hey, maybe I could make a SaaS business out of this. So I put it on a big list of ideas, and in late 2012, I had a flight from San Francisco to Buenos Aires, Argentina, via New York. So it was about 30 hours, and I said I'm going to build and launch the first version of this entire product, soup to nuts, in 30 hours. And I basically did. I started a brand new Rails project and built only the absolute essential things that I thought people would need to actually give me money, and launched it when I landed. It was terrible. It was really bad. Launched it, missed a lot of the features that I think everyone in SaaS would consider essential components, but it did do what it said on the label. You could actually install it and build a store locator. And we launched it, sent out a couple of emails, and within 24 hours, we had 3 or 4 people who clicked the big red button and started paying us $5 a month. Throughout the end of 2012 and 2013, I was still working on a startup and went through the whole thing, brought on a co-founder, launched the product, raised money, and so I had about 5 to 10 hours a week to work on this side project. And throughout that period, we sort of managed to take the product from beer money, a few $100s a month, to rent money, so about $2,000 a month, strictly on the side. And the lessons from that period of time were launch fast and no fluff. And I know that kind of stuff is sort of common knowledge now, but I mean, I really took it to the extreme, not building features until, there was practically a revolt among the customers saying, you must build this feature or we're all canceling. You'd finally build the feature. But if you kind of have the customer need dialed in, they'll stick with it. In early 2014, the startup finally flames out. So we shut it down, and I'm left with this no startup, but a fairly successful side project. And so I left, got on a jet, went to Southeast Asia, became a sort of digital nomad, and decided to try and see if I could make a go of this as a full-time business. And through the next 6 months, essentially sort of quadrupled it to salary money, $7,000, $8,000 a month, something that I felt that I could live on. The lesson from that period of time was that laptops have a real tendency to overheat if you try to work from them on the beach in Thailand. And the other lesson was the real importance of onboarding. One of the things that I was spending a lot of my time on during this period was really dialing in the onboarding process and making sure that we're spending limited time, energy, and resources to find and educate and acquire every customer. You just cannot be putting them into a leaky bucket. Got to make sure as many of them stay around as possible. So I had sort of a viable business. I decided to immediately put it to the test. I made 2 quick hires, hired someone on software development and customer service, and then put that nascent team right to the test. My girlfriend took a sabbatical for a year, and we decided to take a round-the-world trip and go travel through Africa and Mozambique and Japan and Fiji, working remotely for several weeks at a time with limited or no Wi-Fi. And what I learned from that was the importance of really dialing in your internal processes. Even when you have a tiny team, we wrote a bunch of internal FAQs and workflows for this team that I brought on just 3 months before and said, hey, I'm going to be in Africa for 2 weeks, and I'll see you when I get back. So what happened? Well, everything was fine, basically. I think in part inspired by the folks at Buffer. We've been publicizing all of our financial metrics and everything from the get-go, and people have found that really interesting. So over that period where I was traveling around the world, we essentially doubled the revenue to about $18,000 a month in MRR, which was last month. And so this is where I want to sort of switch from the story to some of the lessons. The first thing is the shape of this graph for the last 2.5 years. I think it looks a lot like, as Xavier mentioned, the SaaS, the long, slow SaaS ramp of death. And I think if you are venture funded, if you've raised a bunch of VC money, this is a very scary graph because it needs to look a lot more like a hockey stick. But if you are running a bootstrap business, this is actually a great graph because it means that your costs and your support load and all of that are really predictable. So what it allowed us to do was to sort of slowly hire and bring on new team members and keep the costs under control and to stay very cash flow positive throughout the entire lifetime of the business. And I want to sort of take that chart and talk about retention, which I think is one of the areas where I've seen micro SaaS entrepreneurs really excel, is to have incredibly good retention, potentially slow growth, but coupling that with extremely high retention. And so in the spirit of sharing numbers, we share our numbers for StoreMapper. We have 1,500 customers. Greater than 50% of our customers who sign up for a free trial convert to paid customers, and less than 1% monthly churn. So it means that they're going to stick around theoretically for about 12 years on average. Basically, our customers are more likely to go out of business than to churn out of our product for any other reason. And I think when you couple that with sort of slow, predictable growth, what you end up with is a really valuable business that I think both investors and founders might want to use as another lens for SaaS, where you might have difficulty growing it really, really fast. But if you have great retention and good growth, you end up with this situation where you have a lot of customers that are just going to pay you forever. And the value of that final business can be really, really tremendous, I think. So I want to go through a couple of tactics that I've seen people use to really dial in their retention numbers. First one is that apologies are an opportunity. When you are bootstrapping a business on very limited time, a lot more things go wrong. And so you end up having to apologize quite a bit. But one of the things I found, and I don't really have a good theory for why, but the customers who had something go wrong, we were able to engage with them and apologize and explain what was happening. They turn out to be the best customers. They stick around the longest. They are the most likely to refer new business, even more so than customers who had a sort of flawless onboarding experience. And that's really interesting. And so I think like if something goes wrong in your business, don't necessarily view it as something that needs to be hidden or covered up, but rather as an opportunity to engage with your customers, apologize, be empathetic, and actually potentially maybe increase your retention of those customers. The second one is to massively over-deliver value. So I'm talking about this, I think, a lot through the lens of pricing. A lot of the conversation in SaaS around pricing is to increase prices, run multiple split tests to try to optimize every last bit of revenue out of every customer. And I think that that's good messaging, but I want to take the other side of that for just a second, which is, we ran the same kind of test. We did a big cohort analysis, doubling our prices from where they are now, and it worked. We actually brought on 25% more revenue, even though we got fewer conversions. But what we found was that changed the nature of the relationship with our customer. I think we were pricing very close to the actual value of our product. They had very high expectations for response time, for features coming out of the queue and into production, and they were just really kind of had a higher tendency to just be grumpy. And so we brought the price back down, and what we saw is a lot more, smiley face emojis and rocket ship emojis rather than all caps and exclamation points in our support tickets. And that meant happier support team, happier customers, and I think that translates into much, much higher retention. So if you take the long-term view, you might want to actually under-optimize pricing. The last one is something that I realize I could probably do an entire talk about, this kind of framework called automating empathy. But if you're extremely time and resource constrained, I think what you need to do in SaaS is to empathize with your customer and really try to understand what they're trying to accomplish and what their roadblocks are, and then look for automated solutions, which are the only option if you have very severe time constraints. So just to give one example, our error messages on our app don't say the record failed to save. They say, this record failed to save. Here's the most common problem for this specific error message. Here's the link to the FAQ article that explains what's going on, and here's the best way to contact support. And throughout our onboarding and our error handling and all of that, what we've done is to try to really understand what the customer is doing and then figure out a way to just automatically surface the solution that they need, and it works in terms of retention. So the last thing I want to do is close with why maybe you should think about building a micro SaaS. There's a lot of pretty obvious advantages. They're really good economics and control of your time. You can be location independent. You can have a fully remote team, although you can do that with macro SaaS or big SaaS as well. You could say no and fire your customers. If you're not necessarily optimizing for revenue, you can fire that 1 in 100 customer that's just really annoying. My favorite way that I've heard of doing this is to actually use a referral link for a competitor, but I don't do that, but I've heard it. And I think the best one is that you can be outrageously better. When you're tackling a niche, you can go in there and find that there are still large groups of people that are using processes or software that are just truly terrible. And you can go in there and build something that is just outrageously better than anything they've ever seen, and they'll love it. And we sometimes get like thank you notes from our customers, just unsolicited, that say, thank you for building this app. Like they've been here for 6 months and they just wanted to give us a little note to say thanks. And I think that's pretty awesome. So with that, I want to say thanks to you guys for listening. And here's where you can find me and say hi.
Thank you, Tyler.